Hello world, hello internet, and welcome to the 8th episode of the 2023 Nix Developer Dialogues. I am Valentin, your host. My host name is Frickler Handwerk, and this show is about people and stories from the Nix ecosystem. And today we will look at the very core of it, Nix, the C++ code base on top of everything else is built, in particular Nixpkgs and NixOS. But before we start, let me remind our live audience to send us your questions from anywhere you're watching this. There's also a matrix room, which is linked in the show description on Discord. And if you want to be part of the show and ask your questions in person, there's a link to the studio in the calendar event for today's episode. And now let's welcome our guests today, Thomas Bereknyei and John Ericson. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you.
Great to be here. And thanks so much, Valentin.
Yeah, great for thank you so much for taking time. Great that you're here. Before we start, let me provide a little bit of context for our audience about who you are. You both are very seasoned Nixers. You both started around 2014 with contributing the first commits to Nixpkgs. And John, since then, your name has become quite well known in the Nix community, in particular for contributing and extending cross-compilation facilities in Nixpkgs, and also providing a now pretty famous IPFS integration with Nix, as well as a Git backend for the Nix store. You got 5 RFCs accepted in the community, which is not a small feat if you know how the process works. This is the way for the community to agree on far-reaching changes, which means that you have been part of and still are the groups and people defining the future of how Nix is developed. And for Tom, you've started contributing to the Nix code base around 2021 when you were part of a group that formed around Elko to improve user experience in Nix, as well as the Flakes experimental feature. And I hope we will find some time for you to tell us how that came into being and how it went again. You've also been involved in multiple RFC processes, which are by design a group effort, and those group dynamics are not to be underestimated, and we'll also talk a bit about that. And I hope that you will now tell us more about yourself when you ask my now traditional first and obvious question, how or who or what got you into Nix, and why are you still here? Let's start with you, Tom.
Hi. Yeah. So my story to Nix kind of began as I did software development throughout my career. I did in a lot of weird and interesting places, startups in big corporations and military, government, and all of these sorts of different places. I've encountered a common set of problems and just difficulties sometimes with like software in different environments, sometimes having this fear of being able to do development or to do testing or to do deployments or to distribute the software. And these things kind of kept compounding. And as I came along the way, I kind of came from the Haskell ecosystem, and that I think might have been the initial introduction. And I kind of came across this interesting tool, that solved a very particular set of problems in a very disciplined way. And if you knew how to use that tool well, you encountered this superpower where a whole set of problems either went away or you had a vocabulary to talk about them that otherwise you didn't. And I kind of tested this out in a few realms where it was very productive. It was very, it was a big stark change from what you had otherwise. And so that kind of convinced me, this is how we need to build and run software.
And now you're still here. What about you, John?
Yeah, I think in Tom's story, the one word that really stuck out to me was disciplined. I think that is also kind of what got me to Nix, the discipline of it. I had only started programming recently, also Haskell community around that time. And I just slightly before that had put Linux, Ubuntu on my laptop. And then I'm using these school machines that also have Linux and don't have root, and just I was very new to software development, but I could tell it was a real mess, and there was no systematic way of anything. And the whole logic of what's the system package and what's some ad hoc thing you're doing on top, it didn't make any sense. And I think a friend of mine had similar concerns, and he stumbled upon Nix and Gobo Linux at the same time. And I remember sort of reading things about them, and then never really heard much about Gobo Linux again. Sorry, wherever you are. both got into Nix and have been, just steadily more and more addicted ever since. It's great, powerful stuff, and it brings much needed sanity.
So we've heard about Nix being addictive already from previous guests. Our topic today is undiscovered superpowers, Nix behind the scenes. But before we get into more detail on that particular stuff, let's go back in history a little bit. So I said, Tom, you're a part of this UX group, your X team. How did that come into being, and why were you part of it?
Yeah, so I believe this started out actually internally over at Tweak as just a group of people who were trying to do all sorts of various fixes to the Nix code base. I think I kind of heard about it. I forget exactly how, but I just kind of started going along with them as well. And it was interesting because it was like a working group. We would just get together and we would just pair program on a bunch of things, and got a lot of like just low hanging fruit, just like bugs and little issues kind of figured out, trying to improve the UX. Over time, we started to kind of tackle kind of some larger and larger problems. But it was, I'd say, a quite productive way to just start also getting introduced to it. Like at that point, I had not really done much with the Nix code base itself. So for me, it was helpful because I got to just join other people who were perhaps more comfortable with it, and kind of together figured out all the little details and got introduced to a code base that otherwise might be difficult to get started with.
Yeah, speaking about difficulty, John, you've been working on Nix code base for a couple of years at that point. You've added this IPFS support, and you were thinking about integrating Git more closely into Nix. You were also part of the group, right?
I think I just crashed the UX meeting a few times. And probably the most, you were there, Valentina. I think the most time I lost my cool on a Nix meeting was one of those. Basically, like, well, all this, UX stuff is great, but do we have the foundation to even begin to ask these questions? I felt a little bit like, it was putting lipstick on a pig. First, we have to do something about the pig, and then we can return to do makeup. And happy to say, I think basically everything I dreamed of at that point that seemed way more far-fetched then has basically happened in the past year or so of the Nix team. Not to jump ahead in the agenda here, but yeah.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the Nix team. So you're two of the members of the Nix maintainer team, which got founded about a year ago in October last year. Is that a kind of a follow-up to this UX group, which was a lot less visible than the Nix maintainers today? Tom?
I think so. It was like the natural kind of next step. That group started to kind of peter out with the sorts of things it should do, right? Because we had to go back to do more fundamentals. And so it became less of a focus on UX and more of like, oh, well, hey, we got rid of all the easy things. Now the hard questions need to start to get addressed. And so I think it's a natural consequence of it, if not like a direct descendant.
What are those hard questions that the group had to answer, John?
I think it's less that they're hard than they're just far removed from maybe the things people want to talk about. Our sort of big hot button things have always been like Flakes, maybe the new CLI, like where are we going? These sort of big agenda controversy questions. And I think they're definitely important to answer, but there's a lot of sort of boring, low-hanging fruit that is just easier to address first as a sort of smaller questions, simpler questions, a trust-building exercise too. I think that is also a very important thing we've done. That's on the sort of not even about Nix itself or the code itself per se. And just sort of after kind of, going through the dirty laundry, or not the dirty laundry, going through the dusty corners and the sort of boring bits, we've all kind of gotten to know each other. And at least for me, I really like the shape of the code base now and sort of a lot of the basic infrastructure. And then that gives you this sort of big running start to go actually deal with all the controversial bits.
Why, Tom? Why was it necessary to have this kind of team to begin with? Why wasn't it enough to just continue asynchronously, like people did all the time before. So we had Tefan a couple of days ago talking about how kind of this new team grew out of Elko leaving Tweak, and now things being more distributed and stuff like that. Why was it important to have a team? Many people say they don't even like all those meetings and being there in person, and written communication is just good enough.
Having a team makes some things a bit easier, right? So you can do things asynchronously. Sure, that's possible, but it's hard to build trust asynchronously. And it's also a faster way, I think, to actually try to get things done. Because now you can actually have a more of an informal relationship. You can actually look at things and kind of discuss things, live. That sort of like triage, that sort of decision making, it just happens in a much faster clip. So I think that's one piece of it. Another reason to have a team is to continue to ensure that there's like a broader kind of contributor base. That's something kind of, I think for a little bit, we start to kind of not have so much, right? We had very few people doing contributions. A big focus of the team right now is not just for the team itself to make contributions, but to ensure that we can have as many contributors as possible. And that kind of takes a little bit of concerted effort to take a look at the controversial decisions and try to decide on them, to do some of the janitorial work to clean things up, to make it easier for others to contribute either in a drive-by or to kind of accept those things. And that takes a lot of dedicated time, and a team kind of is basically just people dedicated to put in some time over a long period of time to make that possible.
So what is it that the team does, John? What's the day-to-day operations of the Nix team?
Well, we triage PRs and issues, and also team members, and I suppose anyone else that can manage to get a hold of the right URL can just throw random things on the agenda. I and Tom ended up talking a bunch about Hydra, our most recent one, and the staging environment for that. I'd say it's pretty informal in terms of exactly what we do, but that has worked out quite well, as so much of it is a trust building exercise for, a lot of open source projects are mainly async managed. I think that's fine, but given the way we were starting with something that really the culture was the exact opposite of Nixpkgs, which was always kind of chaotic and a huge long tail of contributors. Nix itself was really it was Elko's PhD project, and mainly people used it, and the chaos was outside the gates. And so to just sort of do some of the things we were all used to from Nixpkgs super async in a more synchronous and trust building fashion was, I think, super important.
So we'll definitely talk more about trust and controversial issues and questions, and definitely flakes. And for that, please send us your comments and questions. I've seen in the past episodes that people are really eager to know more about flakes and who else should talk about this rather than Nix maintainers. We also, of course, talk to Elko, but in one of the next episodes where it will be more about the foundation and larger scale issues. So today's the show to talk about flakes and everything in the Nix C++ code base. So what are the challenges for the Nix team right now, Tom? Is that something that deserves particular focus, something that is particularly hard, especially maybe in the context of controversy or trust building or technically?
Yeah, so one is the agenda setting, right, and roadmap setting. That's one piece where it's an ecosystem where we're kind of a little bit constrained. This is a self-imposed constraint of wanting to make sure that we have really good backwards compatibility, right? We want to be able to say, hey, things that kind of built and evaluated in the past continue to do so. And that's a pretty, it is somewhat limiting. It means you can't just kind of change things on a whim because you kind of inherit the mistakes of the past, perhaps, or the design differences from the past. So that's a limiting feature. And then also moving forward, right, you don't always have, you don't always see the things the same way. So moving forward and how things should be also becomes a matter of building consensus, which is not always super easy. This is why the trust in the team helps with this, because now we can actually see each other's point of view a little bit better, or at least we understand it, if not always agree. And it also helps us get to agreement, by having that trust. So there's pros and cons to this effort. I think moving forward, the biggest questions are with regards to, hey, we have a kind of seems like always increasing set of experimental features, right? Things that are people start to rely upon. How do we make these things stable and actually provide long-term stability? That's right now the main focus of the team moving forward.
Interesting point about long-term stability, and you said earlier that the team is supposed to provide long-term support and maintenance for contributors. How do you sustain this? Do you do this on your free time? Because many contributors work on their free time. How do you do it?
For me, it's a split. I mean, some of it is actually what I can do as part of my job. Some of it is my personal time. This is, like I said, I believe that the approach Nix uses, this disciplined approach, is the way we should run software. And I think it's basically kind of a work that humanity needs. And so I think that I'm essentially 100% bought in that this is the way to do it. So I will do as much as I can to make that a possibility. That's why I'm always focused on how we get kind of more adoption. How do we make it easier for people to get onboarded, right? Make this less of a niche tool for experts and a bit more generally applicable, generally used.
What about you, John? I think you're the second largest contributor in terms of code change in the past 1 or 2 years. How do you sustain that amount of effort?
Who knows? It is also a mix of some things during work, some things in free time. I mean, I like doing refactors. I like sort of it compiles, it works. And I think this makes it, I don't know, it melts my brain, but it's also sort of easy to slide in between other tasks, just like move some things around, fix a bunch of compile errors, and then it's all back together again. Kick off a PR and repeat that 200 times. Yeah, it's been a fun process.
Okay, let's talk about. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Let's talk about undiscovered superpowers then. So we had in the past some discussions about what Nix is even supposed to be, like what is the goal for the project, and apparently everyone kind of has their own image of the present and the future. So what is Nix for you specifically? John, let's start off with that.
Yeah, I think Nix itself is sort of beautifully boring, really. It's a build system, does batch jobs, it sandboxes them. With our C92, it can hopefully do higher order batch jobs, but it's sort of actually a very beautifully narrow scope of we're just we're doing these computations, they finish. It's not ongoing like a server, and they have outputs. It's not like Jenkins where you just fire off some shell script monster that has some arbitrary side effect and who knows. The layering's always been super key for me. The things people usually want, the sort of specific needs, are often addressed to the higher level. Whether you want a distro, you need an OS, you have Nix OS, you have dot files, home manager. If you just need a bunch of the whole world packaged up Nix packages, Nix isn't really supposed to like necessarily dive at an exact problem, but be this sort of key silent thing that underpins all these other things that are more stabbing at specific problems. Just super reliable and super omnipresent.
That doesn't really sound like a purely functional package manager, because that's what it says on a front page.
Well, don't get me started on the website, or maybe do.
Tom, what about you?
I like to think about it as there's like the saying about like the hard things in computer science, right? Cache invalidation, naming things off by one. And Nix kind of addresses 2 of those, or 3, depending on how you count them. This idea of giving things a name is a really powerful concept. And we give computations a name, right? Normally it's for building software, but it's really just a piece of like a batch job, as John was saying, and we just give them a name, and then that makes it easier to do cache invalidation. It makes it boring. And building upon that boring framework, you actually can build a lot of interesting things, right? We've built an operating system on top of it. You could build software on top of it. You could build CI/CD. You could do data transformations. There's all this. Once you have those primitives, there's now this like open door of like possibilities you can build. And if you wield those powers correctly, it becomes pleasant, it becomes fun, it becomes productive, it becomes valuable. Orders of magnitude like faster development processes and outcomes than when I've tried to do similar sorts of feature sets kind of put together ad hoc. Instead, having this like I can rely upon some of these feature sets, and I can rely upon these. Not for everything, right? There's a subset of the problems in the world we can address with this, but for that subset, it is liberating.
So what is that subset of problems? What are those powers of Nix that are blatantly obvious already, but maybe not expressed concisely?
Concisely is hard here, but the building and compiling of software, right? That's just like where Nix kind of originally came from, which is the be able to put software onto another machine and have it work when it works when it gets there. That's I think one of the first lines of Ilko's thesis, and that's pretty powerful, right? For a long time, you didn't really have that, and I think that's just kind of the beginnings. We just have to kind of also find more ways to leverage this sort of feature. I like this concept. I think you and I discussed this at one point about the just having a way to handle and talk about like just staged computations, these batch jobs, right? Giving them a name, being able to distribute them, right? Now I could safely distribute computation as well. That's a really powerful feature, right? I can distribute them not just to other like machines, but other architectures, other operating systems, right? This sort of cross-platform, cross-system capability, where most of the time when we're talking about these, I don't have to care about what type of a system it's on, right? It will work here or there on my Mac, on cloud, and that's really helpful, right? It gives me I could push computations to where they need to go, and I don't have to do a bunch of administration and setup, right? The system and the administration and setup is there for me. If I need some sort of a compiler, if I need some sort of a tool, it'll end up getting there. That requires bookkeeping, and you need a system to help keep track of that, because humans just can't do this. Like our brains are not good at this. Computers are way better at it. Let's rely upon computers to do the things humans suck at. Seems like a good motto.
That does sound very general, though. John, what else is it that Nix can concretely do except like literally do computation, possibly in a distributed manner?
Yeah, well, it's supposed to do it correctly, which somehow all the other things seem to fail to do that. I mean, most of computing is just like duct taping together these 80% solutions that like don't actually do what they claim to do. Like we don't have like magic caching things. We have just correct sandboxing. Like the things you depend on, they're actually what you depend on. No, like but these other things, and just by like not having these impurities and exceptions in general, voiding the warranty, we can actually do things. Like building software is never supposed to be hard. It's just a pure function. Files go in, files come out. It's supposed to be simple. And then somehow in this industry became absolutely insane and super complex because we're like really mean to ourselves or something. I don't know. And then Nix is just like, no, we're going to make things that work the way they're supposed to work and just slowly grind through all the tech deck and make it easy again. And I mean, there's still a learning curve. It's still like not all the way there again, but the basic foundations are there. And so, it feels nice to finally be going down the right path and not the wrong path and trying to make it work despite that.
Okay, we'll talk about more about simplicity and ease of use in a minute. Don't forget to send your questions and comments. I love the audience for like being still an invaluable source of inspiration, infinite source of inspiration. But I wonder, so you talked about Haskell and pure functions, pure computation. How much does Nix actually have to do with Haskell? So I've seen that the Haskell community does have some overlap, but what's your point on this? John, you've been active in the Haskell community quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, you certainly don't have to use one to do the other. That's a very important disclaimer that always serves to be repeated. There is definitely some similar ideas, similar philosophies. The more you go into the inner sanctum of Haskell, actually, the more people dislike Nix. So it's sort of like a funny, like the Nix fandom in Haskell is sort of almost a donut more than a ball. And I guess as the more I get involved with Haskell, the more I see the pit or the blank space in the middle of that. So I almost forget the overlap, but definitely in the broader Haskell world, yes, a bunch of Haskellers got into Nix. The Haskell integration in Nixpkgs done by Peter Simmons about the time I started was just this huge watershed moment of like, no, we can have all the packages for a library ecosystem in the distro package set, which hadn't really been done before. And sort of keeping alive the dream of like the, cradle to grave building software in a consistent way. Yeah, and in general, like the sort of, be disciplined, squeeze out that last impurity, squeeze out that last side effect. It's annoying, but then it really does get much nicer. Hope
John, do you want to contribute on the Haskell topic? Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, I think there's a similar maybe psychology or like a motivation in some sense behind it, where it a little bit with that discipline, right? It's the like, well, if we apply discipline and to a certain point, then we get benefits out of it. And Haskell applies that to like a general purpose like language. Nix kind of applies this to a slightly different domain. And I think this idea of like, invest in, just enough discipline to reap the rewards. I think that's very similar. There's, similarities in terms of like just the nuances of the Nix language at Haskell, right? There's like a laziness similarity. There's this kind of coming from a functional programming world. So there's a lot of like vocabulary overlap, and some of that history is there. But we're all solving different problems.
Now about the ease of use. So you said if you know how to use the system, you can reap all the benefits. What's the problem? Why is it so hard to use then?
It's a very general tool, right? And I think that is going to apply very often to very general tools. It's also right now in the sense of like it's a general tool that's very powerful. So let's compare it to like having like a lathe in a mechanic shop. Very powerful tool, can do all sorts of things, can create all sorts of great machines, but you need to be trained how to use this safely, and you could very easily mess up. And so that's kind of the status that the tool was in for a long time. Now the question is, can we kind of take that and make it safer? Can we make it so that there's less chance of someone kind of messing something up, or less requirements for training up front, and less dedication of how many years of study it takes to use this effectively, and kind of reduce that barrier to entry? That I think is the kind of the big kind of next step. Why is it hard at the moment? I think it's this generality and this like overpoweredness of it. And so when people get started, they often ask like, well, I don't need to do all the 15 different things. I don't need all 15 superpowers. I only need one, right? But then we need to give a concise answer. Okay, how do you get that one, right? What is the best practice, right? If you have a bunch of artisans using tools, each artisan is going to give you 15 different answers on how to build whatever the next big like cabinet needs to be, right? You're not asking, how does the factory produce a standardized cabinet, right? Each artisan is going to have their own answer. And so right now, for a while, we were a community of artisans, everyone crafting their own special outcome. And we need to kind of maybe start thinking more along the lines of how can we make, a bunch of people, having this very similar skill set that's more, again, standardized.
Doesn't that power essentially come from the general computation aspect of it? Is just a programming language or just another model of computation? So I've been talking to TVL people in the last show, and their system seems to be even more like that, even more a toolbox rather than a ready-made tool. John, isn't that actually a power? Should Nix become that standardized tool?
Yeah, well, I think it's, we can do both. There can be the lathe, the build your own machine shop, the Sears catalog, the business to business stuff in the really, or artisan to artisan, really, as you said, Tom, sense at the bottom. But then out of those parts, a sort of mass market consumer product can be assembled. I think the dream in the Nix community for a long time is to sort of try to reach developers better. And we have this great infrastructure that we can use to assemble this crazy humongous distro and things. And we have a really good way of working that can scale to randos on GitHub. And how can we just bring that great success to every software shop? But there is definitely big challenges there. It's a different audience. Building development environments and development workflows in CI is surprisingly not the same as sort of the just simplest thing you can get away with for a distro, and more of the release job that's less incremental and whatnot. And of course, a lot of development shops, they don't want to think endlessly about this, perfected DevOps thing. They just want to get something done, and maybe their core competency is supposed to be something else. If it's a machine learner stuff, let's say they barely want to think about programming at all. It's just screwing around in Python is how I plan out my neural network thing. I hate it. I hate Python. I hate wrangling with pip, all those things. So, helping people that don't want to become domain experts in the thing we're good at, allowing people to stay ignorant of the bullshit so they can just focus on the thing they actually care about. That's very different. And it will take a different, it will take differences than what's been our bread and butter so far. And I think that's perfectly fine.
A difficulty is having both, keeping those qualities that the power users want, those artisans want to keep, as well as having the qualities that makes it more available to the masses. Having one or the other, right, is far simpler. But preserving both, and kind of having both those audiences and user bases be satisfied, that's a far harder challenge for design.
Okay, I have two questions. So one is, Tom, you said John, you said the Nix should cater to more developers, but what is the current audience if it is not developers? What makes it hard even for developers, as you frame them, to use Nix?
Yeah, I think, it's funny. A lot of people that use Nix are developers, but you kind of have to be willing to drink the Kool-Aid. The thing we're probably we're best at is NixOS and Home Manager and these sort of more ops things, even though we don't draw from what you would consider a classic ops sort of person. I guess, I might have lost where I was going with that.
Well, what's the type of person currently using Nix then?
Yeah. I guess it's the person that's happy with Nix is probably someone who is quite a competent developer, but has done some ops things at some point and knows what those what pain is being avoided. If you've always been sort of I'm a developer and someone else is managing my build environment, you'll probably think Nix is a bunch of bullshit hoops to jump through. And if you've only been an ops person and never done any development, you'll probably find it really weird and challenging and oh my God, what is all this endless untyped code, and what is even the interface, and just melting in front of the all like the like Nixpkgs is terrifying because it's like collected all the stuff and all its tech debt and put it in one spot. It's like the sin eater is a phrase I've learned lately. It's the sin eater of the open source world. It's just like collected all that pain and you know, made it appear, made it code and not just like vibes out in the ether, and put it down, and you can see it and you can feel it, and it's you know, it's awe-inspiring in the positive and negative senses of the word.
And you run into it every day. You have to work with it. Tom, what needs to be done to get rid of that, to make life easier for people who are either more into ops or just more into dev and don't want to deal with the bullshit that Nix either presents itself by virtue of collecting tech debt or by exposing it to the world?
Well, we have to, I think first off, we have to kind of make sure that we address different needs, right? So I usually split you know, the Nix people into 3 different kind of categories, right? You have got the more the developer, the person who wants is like building software, they want developer environments. Then you have people who are like they're tweaking things. They're trying to configure their settings. They're trying to manage their dot files. These people tend to come in via like the home manager route. They have more like the sysadmins. These are the people who love the NixOS declarative like operating system as like their entry point. And then usually those entry points then force you then start to the like, or expose you to the other things. And then you start, you know, very quickly once you get a hold of that person's, you know, obsession and fascination, they then quickly spawn into the all other 3 categories. But each of those, the entry point's very different, right? If you have that developer, you tell them, hey, your entry point into the ecosystem must be the operating system, you'll lose them, right? If you have the sysadmin who's like, hey, step 1, you need to start doing development, again, you'll lose them. So I think we have to understand that there's different pathways and there's different interests for each of these people. How to make this easier? That's, I think, part of what we're trying to do, right? That's what the Nix team's kind of focusing on right now, is to make these entry points easier, either by fixing the fundamentals or by fixing the user interfaces, better documentation, better tutorials, having a more coherent story, right? Rather than just saying, here's a set of power tools, hopefully you can like learn them without hurting yourself and get started. Instead, saying like, hey, here's some recommended ways to get started. Here's the best practices. Here's the solutions for the 10 most common problems you're going to encounter. Here's how like they should be solved, and making sure those stories are again like coherent and reasonable, and don't force you through too many hoops. Making that the learning experience something that we start optimizing.
Okay, let's get more into the large elephant in the room, into the Flakes topic. What role does Nix itself, the C++ code base, play in all of this? Because what you've been just talking about is essentially something that happens in code that is written in the Nix language, and Nixpkgs, home manager, Nix, as you've been naming them, all of these tools surrounding Nix itself. What's Nix's role in this whole ecosystem, John?
Yeah, Flakes is an interesting thing. Maybe before we get there, just to follow up on the sort of thing Tom was saying, but to that question, I think there'll be sort of a growing apart and a growing back together. So we'll see sort of more products and things that are trying to very much downstream from Nix, separate from Nix, blaze a sort of, you know, curated singular vision of like what does an easier way of working look like, and sort of seeing a bunch of different 1,000 flowers bloom is the expression, that and you know, some will succeed and some will fail, and we'll just learn more like different ways of reaching an audience. That'll be really good. And then I also think at some point the software freedom dream was always that any component of software I'm using, I could also be a development for. And I think at some point, Nixpkgs also needs to rise to that occasion where it's not good enough to just reproducibly do a highly unincremental, inconvenient from scratch build of things, but to actually like weave together incremental development quality builds into your whole system and have Nixpkgs dog food what is like an actually good development workflow for each package, even if most people are just using it and not going to develop it on it. And so this sort of second step will then kind of recombine the threads and the use cases and the user stories again. So everyone's empowered to be a regular user 6 days a week, and then 1 day a week, just like roll a die, pick a package, and just start modifying files, and without a terrible debug cycle, put their machine together again. So I do think, eventually it'll all be one and stuff, but we can't just immediately dive right into that. We have to explore a bit first.
So yeah, what does Nix do about that? Again, that was about Nixpkgs. This is happening kind of outside of the C++ space. Why is Nix here?
Well, Nix needs to not get away in that. I guess, I've been working on this thing on and off called dynamic derivations, which is if you're just thinking on the package level, you can be static like Nix today. You run your eval thing before you do any building, your first stage, and you have a big plan that has package granularity for all the things. And then you build that. And that's fine, but unsuitable for development because each step is too slow. And if you're working on a single project, you can also be static of like, oh, I will just write down in my Bazel, let's say, every C file, every header, have a line per file, and just handwrite the big graph. That is the incremental build. And that also works. But if you try to imagine both of those at once, having all 10,000 packages and then all hundreds of files for a package, it just gets too unwieldy. And so the hopeless thing like that is to sort of, how do we scale up the development quality build to the whole thing? We need a way to not pre-plan everything, to sort of dynamically or in multiple stages discover what the nitty-gritty fine-grained granularity is per package and not have to deal with every single source file that goes into my computer, which just could be millions of things at once and just too much mind melting again. So yeah, that I guess, right. Having Nix basically scale up with finer and finer grained steps without running into issues. That's definitely a big project or the big project for me.
Probably not coincidentally, this is something very similar to what the Twix developers said in the last show, that this is what they're doing is about scaling Nix to a large scale use cases. Tom, so what's Flakes? What is it even, and which role does it play? Which problems do Flakes solve?
So yeah, Flakes kind of came out of I think kind of two high-level goals, right? I think so. The first is standardization. There was a set of standards that kind of the Nix community has started to adopt, but they were kind of either they weren't actually standard or they were just conventions. And then the second is to kind of give us a vocabulary to talk about like remote resources, right? Make URLs meaningful. Along the way, there was also this concept of being able to have what we call pure evaluation, right? So it was, we have all these like pure sandboxed builds, but then to be able to kind of get the same outcome that someone else had, it actually took a little bit of steps. It took expertise. You had to know how to use the tool to end up with kind of the same outcomes as someone else. And so to make that a little bit easier so that like the by default usage of this tooling is more reliable, is more reproducible at all phases of operation, right? Not just the building and compiling, but also in the evaluating. Flakes kind of is the set of features that kind of combine to make those higher level outcomes possible. This kind of, I think it started originally with some of the work by Shay Levy out of Target. And then Ilko kind of did a whole bunch of work with that a few years ago. I think it got a big big interest via the Summer of Nix programs that took place over the past few years. And it's also, let's be honest, it's also polarizing, right? Because anytime you say, hey, here is a standard, well, now there's going to be differences as to what should be the standard, right? You don't meet all use cases at the same time. We're not optimizing for all use cases at the same time. And now that balance between what you expose for the power user and what you expose for that ease of use sometimes comes in conflict. And so whose use case do we prioritize? How do we make a good user experience without destroying those the very features that we want to preserve? I think that's what causes a lot of the contention around this topic.
Yeah, John, can you illuminate this contention a bit? What is it exactly that is polarizing about Flakes?
Yeah, there's both process level contention and technical design level contention. I think it's always important to bring up both, because a lot of people only think about one and forget that other people are mad about the other. And it's really the combination of the two that has made it been such a maelstrom of feelings. On the process level one, it felt like the thing was supposed to be experimental, but it was promoted from the get-go, and it was kind of unclear how to influence the design process. And so it seemed like there was this thing set in stone. And exactly like Tom said, this was supposed to standardize the process, but it didn't seem like necessarily like a community-based standardization of, let's say, the best things we were doing in Nix packages or something. It seemed to like a parallel track of all of these, codified ways of doing things just sort of appeared. So I think that made a lot of people uncomfortable. And then separately on a technical level, there is like I guess like there is these sort of questions of exactly what is the unit of reuse. Are you trying to make something that's super configurable, that the sort of downstream project can plug in all sorts of different arguments like a big fancy function? Or is it supposed to be kind of more of a whitelist of known good things and less flexible? And there's just sort of one concrete thing to make that less abstract is the question of the system parameter. Most Flakes today will just list a few supported systems, that ones that are going to be CI probably, and that's what you get. And you just fish out the one you want. If you're trying to build stuff for a different platform, even if it would work fine and just no one's bothered to test, there's very unclear how you would write a Flake to work with that, unless you do sort of overlay things where essentially you have a Flake that just provides another function that you do stuff. But then at that point, it's like, well, what is actually the Flake doing if it's just a packager of this underlying function that's the real reusable thing? So we've stewed a lot on those problems, and they're hard. I don't know what the solution looks like yet. But I've liked what we've been doing the past few weeks, months about Flakes and related questions, and I'm very confident it's going to lead to some good places.
So John is in the community well known for being critical or at least skeptical about Flakes development. Tom, can you provide some counterposition to this? What is what Flakes proponents argue for?
Well, it's really, it's a matter of defaults, right? Defaults and standardization, right? We're not really doing all that much that can't be built yourself. And so, but we end up seeing, right? So I tried to get Nix adoption in a lot of places. And whenever I went anywhere, I essentially had to, like, as the person bringing this in, invent a bunch of structure, invent a bunch of standards. Like, here's how you need to organize this. Here's where you put this. Here's where you put that. And then, how to communicate that and impose it, right? And so I actually see this as a large sense of like us saying, yep, here's a standard structure. And now that standard structure is not actually all done. I think, John brings up a good point where, like, some of these things, the standard structure is not yet defined. Like flakes actually don't tell you how to solve this problem. And so we're back kind of almost to where we started, was you might need an expert on hand to tell you how to do it, or to reinvent a new way how to do it, or reinvent the wheel again. But that's the idea, right? Is make it easier for us to distribute and reuse software. Now, what's fascinating here is that Nix allows us to reuse software in an unprecedented way, right? We could reuse the binary artifacts, we could reuse the build recipes, we could reuse the overlays, we could reuse so many different things that are nuanced in how they might be different, and doing so effectively for all the cases, again, is a design challenge. But I think the biggest thing that I love is that, especially with regards to flakes, is once you have a team, once you have a group of people who are kind of using this and collaborating, it makes collaborations so much easier. I could just say, hey, I have a bug with X. Boom, I give you a reference and you could go run the thing and you end up with the same bug. Or I have some behavior that I need investigated or looked at. And I don't have to walk you through 15 steps on how I got into some weird state, or what I had to install, or how I had to go about doing it. I just give you a reference to a thing, and you can now reproduce either my environment or my bug or my software or whatever the case happens to be. I can now collaborate with people. That is really powerful when it's kind of working smoothly. Everything's kind of on the same page. And I just want that to be more broadly applicable. Is it there yet where it needs to be? Probably not. But I think any solution that does solve this problem probably looks very, very similar to what flakes look like at the moment. Yeah, I'm sure there's differences here and there, but I do think we're moving in the right direction. There are going to be some tweaks and changes along the way, but it makes me hopeful that we're probably seeing something closer. We have glimpses of a system that we want to be able to use and promote.
Okay, I have two follow-up questions. One is about the role of who's designing these standards and defaults, and the other one is about the future direction and deciding what that is supposed to be. So first of all, why is it that Nix has to design this from the bottom? John, you said that many people in the community were uneasy about flakes essentially defining standards from architecturally below. What are the alternatives? And does the Nix maintainers team really solve that problem? Now we're just 6 people instead of 1?
I mean, it's definitely getting better. I think there's there's no one single company that is at the center of the Nix right now, which is, I think, a really healthy place to be. We have this sort of friendly competition and different ideas and sort of marketplace of approaches, and that's really, really good. I think also, not to spoil the next bit, that this sort of bottom-up standardization approach we've been doing is also really good to figure out that, maybe just having a decent but not perfect standard is good for a certain sort of audience, but making sure that the standard is just a thin layer on top of more reusable, less opinionated building blocks is a great way to sort of hedge that and say, well, maybe someone, is a bit more idealistic, is a bit more, we can, blow up in popularity 5 years from now, not today. And then they can reuse those building blocks and sort of start working on the next standard. I'm on the record saying that, flakes maybe should be a separate executable on top of Nix, or we should have a build of flakes that doesn't have, or build of Nix that doesn't have flakes. Just as we can have a build of Nix that doesn't have the language. I guess, yeah, some people have read that and they're like, wow, that sounds like a really big deal. But the beautiful result of, I think, our years so far, the Nix team, is it actually feels pretty lightweight to me. If we're in a position where, never mind the marketing, never mind what things are called, we agree that putting things in nice layers and separating concerns is good. Those could be really easy questions to tweak. Whether there's a lib flakes in the same repo, or then flakes exp uses that, or something moves to a different repo. They're technically very lightweight questions of just slicing and dicing things slightly different because the underlying layers are already there. So I'm like, the main thing I've been telling people now is I don't know exactly where we're going with flakes, but this I really do feel like we're making progress now. Again, just working up being the tortoise, not the hare, and the result's going to be good. I just really honestly don't know what that result quite looks like yet.
Okay, well, we'll spend the last few minutes on these next step and what the maintainers team is currently working on. But the second question I had to Tom, so what design direction should this thing take, since you're saying we just need better defaults? Who's supposed to say that? Is that the Nix team's role?
In some sense, yes. There's a lot of input, right? There's input from community. There's input from RFCs. There's like the team itself, and we're trying to make sure that there's kind of a broad input to these things. And one of the jobs of the team is to kind of set this direction. And I think that's kind of the only way we can actually probably make forward progress, is to say, hey, here's a set. It's not going to satisfy everyone, but here's a direction we're going in, and that is the role that I think that it takes. Not all, like, it's hard to do design by consensus. Is kind of one piece of it, especially when it's contentious, especially when you're kind of changing or touching something that people care deeply about. So having a bit of like leadership, having a bit of design like direction provided by a team helps make that possible. We just got to make sure that we include the concerns and the input from a broad enough set of people that we're not just kind of leading a whole like portion of the community out to dry. That's where it's our responsibility to take that into account.
Thank you. Sorry. What are these next steps? So you both said we're moving in a good direction. It seems right. We don't know exactly where that will arrive. There may be changes. So what is that direction? Where is the Nix team moving currently, and what are the plans for the future?
This is where I think. Well, this is where I think. So, like, me and John, disagree on some things, but I think we do agree on this like layering approach. That this is a good way to make sure that we have both, right, the UX layers that we might want. In some sense, you could say flakes are just a UX layer on top of the underlying Nix abstractions, the language and the store. So I think improving each of those layers and working on them independently should be possible. And so a lot of the work right now is along the lines of like, let's improve that layering aspect of it. Let's improve the steps along the way so that we can have iteration upon something like flakes without imposing changes or constraints or like weird things happening at other layers of the stack. By making them somewhat separate and modular, we could kind of relieve ourselves of perhaps the danger of being tempted to curtail the system or to make pragmatic short-term decisions at the cost of long-term costs.
Right. So briefly, let's talk about those long-term costs. We have this potential for innovation for people building on top of Nix, for Nix specifying standard to make innovation faster, possible more easily. What are these aspects of stability? Can we just change Nix arbitrarily, John?
Yeah, well, we do really want to keep old code evaluating and the derivations from that evaluating building. But I think I'm very optimistic that I don't think backwards compatibility means we can't have nice things. You can always sort of add another layer of indirection, add another parameter, and make something you didn't like now something that is no longer baked in. Like I personally think having names in store paths is kind of icky and a mistake. We can never remove names from store paths without breaking, decades of stuff. but it wouldn't actually be crazy to like make the notion of a store path some sort of parameter and allow it to be something else instead. And I haven't tried to push that through. It's not a huge priority for me. But if it really became essential that we did that for some purpose, I think though, like, flexibility of the code makes it not unreasonable to imagine such a thing. So I think, yeah, I guess I'm a big believer in that when you keep your tactic down, you keep your options open, and that avoids so much problems where you have other, I think, less principled projects that are just more an ad hoc grab bag of features. They just kind of grind to a halt under their own weight of past mistakes. But with Nix, we're very like pretty disciplined about like, everything needs to be there for a reason. Cut just miscellaneous things which don't belong. Again, following the layers principle, and then that, it keeps the project eternally youthful in a way that you don't often see in software.
Okay, thank you very much. We are slightly over time now. Last bit from the audience, a comment by Christian: flakes are great, period. Thank you very much. Let's keep up the discipline. Thanks for being here, you guys. The next show will be already tomorrow in less than 24 hours on December 4th, Monday at 10:30 UTC, where we'll meet Ronnie and Jos from NLNet and talk about the big picture and public funding in open source. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time at the 2023 Nix Developer Dialogues. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
And thank you, Valentin.